The Boeing 747 shuddered as Captain Hayes pressed the intercom button with trembling fingers, his voice barely steady enough to reach the 347 passengers seated behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." In seat 34B, wedged between a snoring businessman and a mother trying to quiet her crying infant, Chen closed her eyes and felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle around her shoulders like an old coat. 28 years old, 5'3", wearing a faded Northwestern University sweatshirt that had seen better days, she looked exactly what she was supposed to be. Nobody special. Just another face in economy class. Another passenger hoping to make it from Chicago to London without incident. But as the plane lurched again and the overhead bins rattled ominously, Maya's trained ear caught something the other passengers missed: the subtle change in engine pitch. The barely perceptible shift in the aircraft's attitude. The way the flight attendant's smiles had grown just a fraction tighter around the edges. Her phone buzzed against her thigh, a text message that shouldn't have been possible at 37,000 feet. Maya glanced around quickly, then pulled the device from her pocket. The screen showed an encrypted message from a number she hadn't seen in 3 years. "Range Legend, we need you. Conference line open. Priority Alpha." Her fingers went numb. Range Legend, the code name she'd tried so hard to forget, buried along with everything else from her old life. Maya looked toward the front of the cabin where Captain Hayes had emerged from the cockpit, his face pale as he spoke in urgent whispers with the head flight attendant, Sarah Morrison. Whatever was happening up there, it was bad enough to break protocol and contact her directly. The businessman beside her stirred, muttering something about turbulence, while the mother across the aisle bounced her baby more frantically. These people had no idea that their lives might depend on the woman in the middle seat who looked like she couldn't organize her own sock drawer, let alone save a commercial airliner. Maya's mind raced back to the moment she'd walked away from it all, the congressional hearing, the pointed questions about her unconventional methods. The way they'd made her sound like a rogue agent instead of someone who'd spent 7 years preventing disasters that would have made international headlines if they'd actually happened. She'd been 25 then, exhausted by the weight of secrets and the constant pressure of being the invisible guardian between chaos and catastrophe. "I can't do this anymore," she'd told Director Elizabeth Hawthorne that gray October morning 3 years ago. "I'm done being your ghost." "You'll always be Range Legend to us," Hawthorne had replied, her voice heavy with regret. "That designation doesn't just disappear because you want a normal life." Now, as Flight 447 continued its subtle but unmistakable descent toward what Maya's trained instincts recognized as potential catastrophe, she understood that some identities were tattooed too deep to ever fade completely. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a direct call, the kind that bypassed normal cellular networks and connected straight to the Emergency Coordination Center, buried 3 floors beneath Reagan National Airport. Maya stared at the screen for a long moment, watching the caller ID that simply read "Control." Around her, the other passengers remained blissfully unaware. The businessman had returned to his crossword puzzle. The mother had finally gotten her baby to sleep. 3 rows back, a college student typed furiously on her laptop, probably working on some paper that felt desperately important to her. Normal people living normal lives, trusting that the systems designed to protect them would continue working as advertised. Maya thought about her apartment in Wicker Park, with its view of nothing special and its walls lined with books about marine biology. The career she'd chosen specifically because it was as far from crisis management as she could imagine. She thought about her neighbor's cat, Winston, who would need feeding if she didn't make it home. She thought about the Tuesday night pottery class she'd started taking, where she was finally learning to create something instead of constantly preparing to prevent destruction. But most of all, she thought about the 346 people on this plane who had no idea that their fate might rest in the hands of someone who'd spent the last 3 years trying to convince herself she was nobody special. The phone continued ringing, its insistent buzz cutting through the ambient noise of the aircraft. Maya looked toward the cockpit again and saw Captain Hayes emerge once more, this time scanning the passenger cabin with the desperate look of someone running out of options. His eyes found hers across the crowded space, and she saw the moment of recognition, not of her face, which he'd never seen before, but of the way she was sitting, alert, aware, different from everyone else. He knew someone on this plane wasn't who they appeared to be. Maya's finger hovered over the answer button as the aircraft continued its subtle but inexorable descent. Through the small window to her left, she could see the curvature of the earth far below, a reminder of just how high they were and how far they had to fall. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wing, and she noticed with professional concern that the wing flaps weren't responding correctly to the pilot's commands. This wasn't just technical difficulties. This was a full-scale emergency in progress, and somehow, someone had decided that the woman in seat 34B, the woman who'd walked away from the world of crisis management 3 years ago, was their best hope for preventing catastrophe. The businessman beside her stirred again, this time looking directly at her phone. "Aren't those supposed to be turned off during flight?" he asked, with mild annoyance. Maya met his eyes and saw her reflection in his glasses, a young woman who looked tired, ordinary, forgettable. The perfect cover for someone who'd once been considered the most effective crisis coordinator in the Federal Emergency Response System. "Special circumstances," she said quietly, and pressed the answer button. The voice that greeted her was one she'd hoped never to hear again, deep, authoritative, and tinged with the kind of barely controlled urgency that meant people were about to die if someone didn't act fast. "Range legend," said Director Hawthorne, her voice crackling slightly through the encrypted connection. "We have a situation." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maya closed her eyes and felt the familiar transformation begin, the way her mind automatically shifted into the hyper-aware state that had once made her legendary in circles most people never knew existed. "I'm listening," she said, her voice dropping to the low, controlled tone that her old colleagues would have recognized immediately. "Flight 447 has experienced a cascade failure in multiple systems," Hawthorne continued. "Hydraulics are compromised, navigation is intermittent, and they're losing altitude at a rate that suggests the pilots are fighting for control. We have less than 40 minutes before they're below minimum safe altitude for transatlantic flight." "Why me?" Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. "I've been out for 3 years. There have to be other assets available." "Because you're already there," Hawthorne replied. "And because you're the only person we've ever had who could coordinate a mid-air emergency response while maintaining operational security. The pilots don't know about your background, the passengers don't know about your background, and that's exactly how we need to keep it." Through the phone, Maya could hear the controlled chaos of the Emergency Coordination Center, multiple conversations happening simultaneously, keyboards clicking rapidly, and the low hum of technology working at maximum capacity to prevent disaster. It was a sound she'd once found comforting, the audio signature of a system designed to keep the world from falling apart. Now it just reminded her of all the reasons she'd walked away. "What's the real situation?" she asked, because she knew there was always more to the story than the initial briefing provided. Hawthorne's pause was telling, "The failure wasn't accidental. We're tracking what appears to be a coordinated cyber attack on multiple aircraft systems. Flight 447 is the third plane affected in the last 6 hours, but it's the first one with enough altitude and distance from land to make recovery possible if we act fast." Maya felt the familiar chill that came with understanding the true scope of a crisis. This wasn't just a mechanical failure or pilot error. This was an active threat, possibly ongoing, with implications that extended far beyond the 347 people currently trapped in an aluminum tube 7 miles above the Atlantic Ocean. "How many others?" she asked. 2 other flights went down over the past 4 hours, 1 domestic, 1 international. We managed to keep it out of the news so far, but that won't last much longer. If we lose Flight 447, Hawthorne's voice trailed off, but Maya filled in the blanks automatically. If they lost Flight 447, the story would break wide open. International aviation would grind to a halt. Public confidence in air travel would collapse overnight. And whoever was behind the attacks would have achieved something far worse than the death of passengers. They would have successfully demonstrated that the systems everyone depended on for safe travel could be compromised at will. Maya looked around the cabin again, seeing the passengers with new eyes. The businessman working his crossword had no idea he might be part of a terrorist attack designed to cripple international commerce. The mother with the sleeping baby didn't know that her child's safety depended on Maya's ability to coordinate a response from a middle seat in economy class. The college student typing on her laptop was probably planning a future that might not exist if the wrong people succeeded in proving that modern aviation was fundamentally vulnerable. "What do you need me to do?" Maya asked, because despite everything, despite the years of therapy, the careful construction of a normal life, the promise she'd made to herself to never again be responsible for life and death decisions, she couldn't sit by and watch 346 people die when she had the skills to help save them. "First, we need you to establish communication with the cockpit without alerting the passengers that anything unusual is happening," Hawthorne said. Captain Robert Hayes, 15 years experience, solid record. First Officer Jennifer Park, 8 years, also clean. They're good pilots, but they're dealing with system failures they've never encountered before. Maya glanced toward the front of the cabin and saw Captain Hayes emerge from the cockpit again, this time carrying what looked like a maintenance manual. His movements were controlled but urgent, the body language of someone trying to solve a problem while maintaining the appearance that everything was under control. "Second," Hawthorne continued, "we need you to help coordinate the technical response. Our best cybersecurity teams are working on the attack vector, but they need real-time data from the aircraft systems to understand how the intrusion is operating." "And third?" Maya asked, because there was always a third element in these situations. "Third, we need you to prepare for the possibility that this attack isn't finished. If someone can take down aircraft systems remotely, they might be able to trigger additional failures or change their approach if they realize we're fighting back." Maya felt the weight of invisible responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. For 3 years, she'd managed to convince herself that someone else could handle the crises, that the world would keep turning without Maya Chen, formerly range legend, standing guard against catastrophe. But as Flight 447 continued its gradual descent toward the gray Atlantic far below, she realized that some responsibilities never really ended. They just waited patiently for the moment when they were needed again. "I'll need secure access to the aircraft's technical systems," she said, her mind already shifting into operational mode. "And I'll need a way to communicate with the flight crew without going through normal channels." "Already arranged," Hawthorne replied. "Check your phone for the technical package. It's been uploaded to your device using the same quantum encryption protocols we used during the Meridian crisis." Maya's stomach tightened at the mention of Meridian, the crisis that had made her legendary within the emergency response community and ultimately driven her to quit. 18 months of coordinating responses to what the public had been told was a, quote, series of unrelated infrastructure failures, but which had actually been a sustained attack on multiple critical systems by a group that had never been publicly identified. She'd saved thousands of lives during Meridian. She'd also aged 5 years in 18 months and developed an ulcer that still bothered her when she was stressed. The work had consumed everything: her relationships, her health, her sense of herself as someone separate from the job. When it was over, she'd looked in the mirror and seen a stranger. But now, as she accessed the technical package on her phone and saw the real-time data streaming from Flight 447's compromised systems, Maya felt the familiar rush of clarity that came with understanding exactly what needed to be done. The aircraft was in trouble, serious trouble, but it wasn't unsalvageable. Not yet. "Range legend acknowledging receipt of technical package," she said quietly, using the formal response protocol she'd hoped never to need again. "Beginning assessment now." Maya's fingers moved across her phone screen with practiced efficiency, accessing diagnostic systems that most passengers wouldn't have known existed. The technical package Hawthorne had uploaded contained real-time feeds from the aircraft's primary systems, engine performance, hydraulic pressure, navigation data, and most critically, the cyber intrusion markers that showed exactly how someone was systematically taking control of Flight 447. But even as her mind processed the technical data with the rapid-fire analysis that had once made her invaluable to the Federal Emergency Response System, another part of her consciousness remained painfully aware of the ordinary life she was about to sacrifice once again. 3 years ago, after the Meridian crisis had finally been resolved, Maya had spent 6 months in a cabin in northern Wisconsin, learning how to sleep without dreaming about system failures and cascading emergencies. She'd taught herself to cook simple meals without calculating supply chain vulnerabilities. She'd read novels without automatically analyzing them for crisis management lessons. She'd slowly, carefully rebuilt herself into someone who could exist without constantly preparing for disaster. The process had been harder than she'd expected. For 7 years, Maya's identity had been completely wrapped up in being range legend. The coordinator who could see patterns others missed, who could manage multiple crisis response teams simultaneously, who could stay calm and effective while everything around her collapsed into chaos. Without that role, she'd felt like a ghost of herself, unsure of who Maya Chen was supposed to be when she wasn't preventing catastrophes. She'd tried different careers in those early months. A brief stint at a consulting firm that had lasted exactly 3 weeks before she'd automated half their processes and identified critical security vulnerabilities that no one wanted to hear about. 6 months working for a nonprofit focused on disaster preparedness, until she'd realized she was unconsciously designing response protocols for scenarios that only someone with classified knowledge of emerging threats would consider. Finally, she'd found marine biology, specifically deep-sea ecosystem research. The work was methodical, peaceful, and completely removed from the world of crisis management. She'd spent the last 2 years studying the migration patterns of deep-sea organisms, creatures that lived their entire lives in the quiet darkness of the ocean depths, far from the chaos and complexity of surface world emergencies. Maya had even bought a small aquarium for her apartment, filling it with the kinds of simple, hardy fish that didn't require constant monitoring or intervention. She'd named them after famous scientists: Darwin, a small angelfish; Curie, a bright yellow tang; Tesla, an electric blue damselfish that spent most of its time hiding behind the coral formations she'd carefully arranged. Her morning routine had become beautifully, deliberately ordinary. Coffee at 6:30, made with beans from the shop 2 blocks from her apartment where the barista, Marcus, had started remembering her order. 45 minutes on the stationary bike while watching nature. Documentaries. Breakfast while reading research papers about bioluminescent adaptation in deep-sea species. Work that felt important but not urgent, significant but not life or death. She'd even started dating again, cautiously, with mixed results. There had been David, the librarian, who'd been perfect on paper, but who'd made her feel like she was performing the role of a normal person rather than actually being one. Then Sarah, the graphic designer who'd been interesting and kind, but who'd ultimately found Maya too guarded, too reluctant to talk about her past work in any detail. "You're like a closed book," Sarah had said during their last conversation. "I don't need to know everything about you, but I need to know you're actually there." Maya had wanted to explain that she'd spent so many years being someone else, someone whose very existence had to remain classified, that she was still learning how to be herself. But she couldn't say that without raising questions she wasn't allowed to answer, so she'd simply nodded and wished Sarah well. The loneliness had been manageable, though. Maya had been alone in the midst of crisis teams and emergency coordination centers, often enough to understand that solitude and isolation were different things. She'd built a small but genuine life in Chicago, the Tuesday night pottery class where she was slowly learning to sinter clay and create bowls that actually held water, the Saturday morning volunteer work at the aquarium where she helped maintain the deep-sea exhibition, the quiet Sunday dinners with her neighbor Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old retired teacher who asked no questions about Maya's past and seemed genuinely interested in her fish. But now, as Flight 447 continued its gradual descent and Maya's phone displayed increasingly urgent technical data about system failures that could kill everyone on board, she felt the carefully constructed walls around her new life beginning to crumble. The businessman beside her had fallen asleep, his crossword still open on his lap. Maya glanced at it briefly and noticed he'd gotten 17 across wrong. The answer was contingency, not emergency. It was exactly the kind of detail she would have corrected automatically 3 years ago, back when every interaction was potentially part of a larger pattern that might need to be analyzed later. She forced herself to look away from the crossword and focus on the technical data flowing across her phone screen. The cyber attack was sophisticated, multi-layered, and ongoing. Someone had gained access to Flight 447's systems through what appeared to be a vulnerability in the aircraft's satellite communications system, then used that access to gradually compromise multiple redundant safety systems. Whoever was behind this understood aviation technology at an expert level. They also understood crisis response protocols well enough to time their attack for maximum impact, hitting the aircraft when it was far enough from land that emergency landing options were limited. but not so far that radio communication with ground control would be impossible. Maya found herself automatically building psychological profiles of the attackers based on their technical approach and timing. This was the kind of analysis that had made her valuable during the Meridian crisis, the ability to think like the people creating the emergency while simultaneously coordinating the response to it. But it was also the kind of thinking that had gradually consumed her entire identity, turning her into someone who saw every situation as a potential crisis and every person as either an asset or a threat. She'd stopped being able to have normal conversations because she was constantly analyzing them for operational intelligence. She'd stopped being able to enjoy simple pleasures because she was always scanning for potential problems. The transformation had happened so gradually that she hadn't noticed it until it was almost complete. One day she'd realized that she couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed at something that wasn't related to the absurdity of a crisis situation. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt genuine relaxation rather than just the temporary absence of immediate emergency. Maya's phone buzzed with an incoming message from Hawthorne. Status report needed, time critical. She glanced around the cabin to make sure no one was watching, then typed back, "Systems analysis in progress. Attack is sophisticated and ongoing. Need to establish contact with flight crew before attempting intervention." As she waited for a response, Maya noticed the young woman across the aisle, the college student who'd been typing frantically on her laptop, had stopped working and was staring out the window with a concerned expression. The student was probably noticing the same subtle changes in engine pitch and aircraft attitude that Maya had detected earlier. Not trained enough to understand exactly what they meant, but intelligent enough to sense that something wasn't right. Maya felt a familiar protective instinct rising, the deep-seated need to shield ordinary people from the knowledge of just how dangerous their situation really was. It was the same instinct that had driven her through 7 years of crisis management work. The belief that people deserve to live their lives without constantly worrying about all the ways their world could suddenly fall apart. But that instinct was also part of what had ultimately burned her out. The weight of being responsible for other people's safety, combined with the isolation of being unable to share that responsibility with anyone who wasn't similarly trained and cleared, had gradually worn her down to nothing. Hawthorne's response came quickly. Understood. Flight crew has been notified that a federal specialist is on board and may make contact. Your credentials have been transmitted to Captain Hayes. Proceed when ready. Maya stared at the message for a long moment, understanding that this was the point of no return. Once she identified herself to the flight crew, there would be no going back to her carefully constructed normal life. She would be range legend again, with all the responsibilities and isolation that came with that identity. She thought about her apartment in Wicker Park, with its view of the tree-lined street where nothing dramatic ever happened. She thought about Darwin, Curie, and Tesla, probably swimming peacefully in their aquarium while she sat 7 miles above the Atlantic Ocean, preparing to once again become someone whose existence most people couldn't know about. She thought about the pottery class she would miss next Tuesday and the bowl she'd been working on. Simple, imperfect, but genuinely hers, in a way that crisis management had never been. But mostly, she thought about the 346 people on Flight 447 who deserved the chance to get home safely to their own ordinary lives. The businessman beside her, who should have the opportunity to finish his crossword incorrectly. The mother with the sleeping baby, who should be able to worry about normal parenting challenges rather than aircraft system failures. The college student across the aisle, who should be able to complete whatever paper she was working on and continue planning for a future that assumed the basic systems of modern life would continue functioning. Maya stood up carefully, trying not to disturb the businessman, and made her way toward the front of the cabin. As she walked, she felt the familiar transformation beginning. The way her posture changed, her awareness expanded, and her mind shifted into the hyper-alert state that allowed her to process multiple crisis variables simultaneously. By the time she reached the galley area where Captain Hayes was conferring quietly with the head flight attendant, she was no longer Maya Chen, marine biology researcher. She was range legend, federal crisis coordinator, and the last best hope for preventing Flight 447 from becoming another tragic headline. The transition felt both foreign and familiar, like putting on clothes that had once fit perfectly but now felt slightly uncomfortable after years in storage. Maya could feel her civilian identity, the woman who fed her fish every morning and looked forward to pottery class, receding into the background as her operational persona took control. Captain Hayes looked up as she approached, and she saw the exact moment when he recognized something different about her. It wasn't her appearance, which remained unremarkable, but something in the way she moved through the cabin space, with the confident precision of someone who belonged there. "Captain Hayes," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that nearby passengers wouldn't overhear. "I'm the federal specialist you were notified about. We need to talk." Hayes studied her for a moment. Taking in her economy class appearance and obvious youth, Maya was used to this reaction. The cognitive dissonance that came when people expected federal crisis coordinators to look like action movie heroes rather than tired graduate students. She'd learned long ago to let her competence speak for itself rather than trying to establish authority through appearance or attitude. "Federal specialist," Hayes repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting someone quite so." He paused, searching for the diplomatic way to express his surprise. "Young? Female? Traveling in economy?" Maya supplied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I get that a lot. The important thing right now is that your aircraft is under active cyber attack, and we have approximately 35 minutes to regain control of your systems before you're below minimum safe altitude for transatlantic flight." The color drained from Hayes' face as the implications hit him. "Cyber attack? We thought it was a cascade failure in the hydraulic systems." "It started there," Maya confirmed, "but it's spreading to other systems in a pattern that suggests deliberate intrusion rather than mechanical failure. Your navigation is already compromised, and your communications are being intermittently blocked. Whoever is doing this understands commercial aviation systems at an expert level." Head flight attendant Sarah Morrison had been listening to their conversation with growing alarm. "Should we be preparing for emergency procedures?" she asked. Maya considered the question carefully. Emergency procedures were designed for mechanical failures and pilot error, not for active cyber warfare at 37,000 feet. Standard protocols might actually make the situation worse, by triggering automated responses that could be compromised by the same intrusion that was affecting other systems. "Not yet," she decided. Right now, the attackers seem to be focusing on gradual system degradation rather than immediate catastrophic failure. If we start emergency procedures too early, we might trigger responses they're prepared to exploit. Captain Hayes absorbed this information with the kind of calm professionalism that Maya remembered from other crisis situations. Good pilots were trained to compartmentalize fear and focus on problem-solving, which made them ideal partners for crisis coordination work. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "First, I need access to your primary diagnostic systems," Maya said. "I have technical support standing by, but they need real-time data from your end to understand how the intrusion is operating. Second, I need you to maintain normal flight operations as much as possible while we work on regaining system control. The passengers don't know anything is wrong yet, and we want to keep it that way." Hayes nodded. "Anything else?" Maya hesitated, then decided to share the full scope of what they were facing. This isn't an isolated incident. 2 other aircraft have been lost to similar attacks in the past 6 hours. Flight 447 is part of a coordinated assault on commercial aviation systems, and if we can't stop it here, the implications go far beyond the people on this plane. The weight of that information settled over the small group in the galley. Morrison's professional composure wavered slightly as she processed the idea that they weren't just dealing with a technical emergency, but with an active attack that had already killed people on other flights. "How do we know you're who you say you are?" Morrison asked, which was exactly the right question for a security-conscious flight attendant to ask. Maya had anticipated this and pulled out her phone, accessing a verification protocol that she'd hoped never to use again. The screen displayed her federal credentials, complete with biometric confirmation and real-time authentication from the Emergency Coordination Center. "Range Legend," Hayes read from the screen. "That's your operational designation?" "It was," Maya said. "I've been out of active service for 3 years. This situation was considered serious enough to reactivate my credentials." What she didn't say was that seeing her old designation on the screen felt like encountering a ghost of herself. A reminder of the person she'd been before she'd learned to value the simple pleasure of feeding her fish in the morning and the meditative calm of centering clay between her hands. Hayes studied the credentials for another moment, then made the decision that Maya had seen countless other officials make during crisis situations, the choice to trust expertise, even when it came from an unexpected source. "What do you need to access our systems?" he asked. Maya felt the familiar rush of operational clarity as her mind shifted fully into crisis management mode. The technical challenge ahead was complex, but it was the kind of problem she'd trained for during 7 years of coordinating responses to everything from cyber attacks on power grids to coordinated terrorist operations across multiple cities. "I need 15 minutes alone in your cockpit with direct access to your primary and backup systems," she said. "And I need both of you to continue normal operations so the passengers don't realize anything unusual is happening." As they made their way toward the cockpit, Maya caught a glimpse of her reflection in one of the galley's stainless steel surfaces. She looked the same as she had when she'd boarded the flight in Chicago. Tired, unremarkable, forgettable. But she could see something different in her eyes now, the kind of focused intensity that came with accepting responsibility for other people's lives. She thought briefly about the aquarium in her apartment, where Darwin, Curie, and Tesla were probably swimming their peaceful circuits, unaware that their owner was 7 miles above the Atlantic Ocean, preparing to coordinate a response to an attack that could reshape international aviation if it succeeded. Then she put those thoughts aside and stepped into the cockpit of Flight 447, ready to become range legend one more time. The cockpit of Flight 447 was a symphony of controlled chaos. Dozens of screens displaying critical flight data, warning lights blinking in patterns that told a story of cascading system failures, and the subtle but unmistakable sound of pilots fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was no longer entirely under their command. First Officer Jennifer Park looked up as Maya entered behind Captain Hayes, her expression mixing relief with skepticism. "This is our federal specialist?" she asked, her tone carefully professional despite the obvious surprise. "Range legend," Hayes confirmed. "She's here to help coordinate our response to what apparently is an ongoing cyber attack." Maya settled into the jump seat behind the pilots and immediately began accessing the aircraft's diagnostic systems through her phone. The technical package from Hawthorne had included intrusion protocols that would allow her to interface directly with Flight 447's computer systems, but she needed a few minutes to establish secure connections and understand the full scope of the compromise. "Talk me through what you've experienced so far," she said, her fingers moving rapidly across the phone screen while her eyes scanned the cockpit displays. Park took the lead on the briefing, her voice steady despite the stress evident in her posture. "It started about 20 minutes ago with what seemed like a minor hydraulic pressure fluctuation. Standard procedure called for switching to backup systems. But when we did, the backup systems began showing similar anomalies. Then navigation started acting up," Hayes continued. "GPS coordinates were shifting randomly, and our inertial navigation system began reporting position data that didn't match our actual location. We're currently flying on manual navigation, using radio beacons and dead reckoning." Maya nodded as she absorbed this information while simultaneously processing the real-time data flowing through her phone. The attack pattern was becoming clearer. A sophisticated, multi-vector intrusion that targeted different aircraft systems in a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to gradually degrade the pilot's ability to maintain safe flight. "Communications?" she asked. "Intermittent," Park replied. "We can reach air traffic control about 60% of the time, but our transmissions are being blocked or delayed unpredictably. It's like someone is jamming our signals selectively." Maya's phone buzzed with an incoming message from Hawthorne. "Additional aircraft showing similar intrusion patterns. Attack appears to be expanding. Need status update urgently." She typed back quickly. "On scene in cockpit. Attack confirmed sophisticated multi-vector cyber intrusion. Establishing countermeasures now. Will report progress in 10 minutes. What she didn't include in the message was her growing concern about the technical sophistication of the attack. Whoever was behind this didn't just understand commercial aviation systems. They understood them well enough to exploit vulnerabilities that most security experts wouldn't even know existed. "I need you to walk me through your emergency procedures," Maya said to the pilots. "Specifically, what automated responses are triggered if certain system failures occur simultaneously?" Hayes and Park exchanged glances, understanding that this wasn't a casual question. "Depends on the specific combination of failures," Hayes said, "but generally the aircraft's safety systems are designed to take over if they detect that human pilots can't maintain safe flight parameters." "Those safety systems," Maya said carefully, "how much do they rely on the same computer networks that are currently being compromised?" The implications of her question hit both pilots simultaneously. If the safety systems designed to prevent catastrophic failure were connected to the same networks being attacked, then the aircraft's automated emergency responses could potentially be turned into weapons against the people they were designed to protect. Jesus, Park whispered. They could trigger emergency descents, fuel dumps, even landing gear deployment at altitude. Maya nodded grimly, which is why we need to regain control of your systems before the attackers realize we're fighting back and decide to escalate their approach. Her phone screen showed that she'd successfully established secure connections to Flight 447's primary computer systems. The diagnostic data streaming across the screen painted a picture of an intrusion that was both more extensive and more subtle than the pilots had realized. The attackers hadn't just compromised individual systems, they'd gained access to the aircraft's central computer network, and were using that access to gradually corrupt the data that all other systems relied on. It was like a slow-acting poison, working its way through the aircraft's digital nervous system. "I'm going to start implementing countermeasures," Maya told the pilots. "You'll probably see some fluctuations in your displays as I work to isolate compromised systems and restore clean data feeds. Whatever you do, don't engage any automated emergency procedures unless you're absolutely certain we're facing immediate physical danger." As Maya began typing rapidly on her phone, accessing intrusion countermeasures that she'd hoped never to use again, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Not just for the 347 people on Flight 447, but for the broader implications of what was happening. If this attack succeeded, it would prove that commercial aviation systems could be compromised remotely and systematically. Every airline in the world would have to ground their fleets until new security protocols could be developed and implemented. International travel would collapse overnight. The economic impact would be measured in trillions of dollars and millions of jobs lost. But beyond the economic implications, Maya understood that this attack represented something even more dangerous, a demonstration that the complex technological systems that modern civilization depended on could be turned against the people they were designed to serve. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from a source she didn't recognize. "Stop interfering or all souls on board will be lost. This is your only warning." Maya stared at the message for a moment, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. The attackers knew she was there. They knew she was working to counter their intrusion, and they were threatening to escalate their attack if she continued. She showed the message to Hayes and Park, watching their faces pale as they realized they were dealing with people who were monitoring their response in real time. "What do we do?" Park asked. Maya looked at the message again, then deleted it and returned to her countermeasures work. "We do our jobs," she said quietly. "Those people down there in the cabin trust us to get them home safely. The attackers are counting on us being too afraid to fight back effectively." But even as she spoke those words, Maya felt the familiar tension that came with crisis escalation. The attackers weren't bluffing. They had the capability to cause catastrophic system failures, and they were clearly prepared to kill everyone on Flight 447 to prove their point. Her phone screen showed that her initial countermeasures were having some effect. Several compromised systems were beginning to report clean data again, and the navigation anomalies were starting to stabilize. But even as she made progress, Maya could see new intrusion attempts probing different vulnerabilities in the aircraft's network. This wasn't just a static attack. It was an active cyber warfare engagement, with human operators on the other end adapting their tactics in real time as she implemented defenses. "Navigation is stabilizing," Park reported, relief evident in her voice. "GPS coordinates are consistent again." "Hydraulic systems are coming back online," Hayes added. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." But Maya's attention was focused on a new alert appearing on her phone screen. The attackers were probing the aircraft's fuel management system, apparently preparing to either dump fuel or trigger emergency fuel line shutoffs that could leave Flight 447 powerless over the middle of the Atlantic. She began implementing additional countermeasures, her fingers moving in the rapid, precise patterns that had once made her legendary among crisis response teams. But with each defensive measure she put in place, the attackers seemed to find new vulnerabilities to exploit. It was like playing chess against multiple opponents simultaneously, except the stakes weren't just winning or losing, they were the lives of everyone on the aircraft. Maya's phone buzzed with an encrypted call from Hawthorne. She answered it on speaker so the pilots could hear the conversation. "Range Legend, we've identified the source of the attacks," Hawthorne's voice crackled through the cockpit speakers. We're tracking coordinated cyber intrusions originating from multiple locations, at least 3 different countries based on the routing patterns. This isn't a lone actor or even a single organization. It's a coordinated international operation. Recommendations? Maya asked while continuing to work on the fuel system countermeasures. We're implementing emergency protocols for all commercial aviation. NORAD is tracking your position and prepared to provide escort if necessary. But our primary concern right now is preventing Flight 447 from becoming a proof of concept for further attacks. Maya understood the implication. If the attackers succeeded in bringing down Flight 447, they would have demonstrated that their capabilities were fully operational. Other aircraft would become targets, and the entire global aviation system would be at risk. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "The fuel situation gives us maybe 20 minutes before you're below minimum reserves for transatlantic crossing," Hawthorne replied. "If we can't resolve this soon, we'll need to attempt an emergency landing at the nearest available airfield." Maya looked at the navigation displays and calculated their position. They were approximately 800 miles from the nearest land, too far for a safe emergency landing with compromised systems, but not so far that rescue would be impossible if they had to ditch in the ocean. She made a decision that went against every protocol she'd ever learned about crisis management. Instead of continuing purely defensive countermeasures, she was going to go on the offensive. "I need you to patch me through to our best cyber warfare specialists," she told Hawthorne. "If these attackers want to play hardball, I'm going to show them what Range Legend was really designed for." The transformation was complete now. Maya Chen, the woman who fed her fish every morning and looked forward to pottery class, had been entirely subsumed by Range Legend, the federal crisis coordinator who had once coordinated responses to attacks that threatened the fundamental infrastructure of modern civilization. Hazen Park watched in fascination as Maya's approach shifted from defensive countermeasures to aggressive cyber warfare tactics. Her fingers moved across the phone screen with the rapid precision of a concert pianist, implementing intrusion protocols that most people wouldn't have known existed. "What exactly are you doing?" Park asked. "I'm tracing their attack vectors back to their source points," Maya replied, without looking up from her screen. "If they want to play games with Flight 447, I'm going to make them regret it." Through her phone, Maya could access not just the aircraft's systems, but the same quantum-encrypted networks that she'd used during the Meridian crisis to coordinate responses across multiple agencies simultaneously. It was technology that theoretically didn't exist, operated by organizations that officially didn't exist, in response to threats that the public was never supposed to know about. But as she began implementing offensive cyber tactics against the attackers, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: the rush of being exceptionally good at something that mattered more than anything else in the world. The attackers had made a mistake when they'd threatened Flight 447. They'd assumed they were dealing with standard aviation security protocols and conventional crisis response teams. They hadn't counted on encountering Range Legend, someone who'd been trained to fight wars that most people couldn't imagine. Maya's phone screen lit up with incoming data as her offensive protocols began generating results. She was tracing the attackers' command and control networks, identifying their technical capabilities, and most importantly, beginning to turn their own intrusion tools against them. "Fuel management system is secure," she announced. "Navigation is fully restored. I'm working on communications now." But even as she spoke, Maya knew that this was just the beginning. The attackers on Flight 447 were part of something much larger, and stopping this one attack wouldn't be enough to prevent future incidents. She was going to have to become Range Legend again, full-time, whether she wanted to or not. The next phase of the engagement unfolded with the rapid, brutal efficiency that Maya remembered from her most challenging crisis management operations. As her offensive cyber protocols began penetrating the attackers' networks, she discovered that the assault on Flight 447 was even more sophisticated than she'd initially realized. The attack wasn't just coming from multiple countries, it was being coordinated by a distributed network of operators who had been planning this operation for months, possibly years. They had detailed technical specifications for dozens of different aircraft models, comprehensive intelligence on aviation security protocols, and most disturbingly, they seemed to have inside knowledge of federal crisis response procedures. "I'm reading multiple intrusion attempts on other aircraft," Maya announced as data streamed across her phone screen. "At least 12 additional flights are currently being probed for vulnerabilities." Hayes absorbed this information with the grim professionalism of someone who understood that they were facing something unprecedented in the history of commercial aviation. Are those flights in immediate danger? Not yet, Maya replied, but if we don't stop the source of these attacks, they will be. The pattern suggests this is a rolling assault, designed to prove that commercial aviation systems can be compromised at will. Her phone buzzed with another threatening message. Last warning. Cease countermeasures or face immediate consequences. Maya showed the message to the pilots, then deleted it and continued her work. But she could see on her phone screen that the attackers were preparing to escalate significantly. They were positioning to trigger multiple emergency systems simultaneously, a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the aircraft's safety protocols and likely result in catastrophic failure. I need both of you to be ready for immediate manual override of all automated systems, she told Hayes and Park. In about 30 seconds, they're going to try to trigger every emergency procedure at once. Don't let the aircraft's computers take control under any circumstances. The attack came exactly when Maya had predicted. Every warning light in the cockpit began flashing simultaneously as the aircraft's systems registered multiple critical failures. Automated voices began announcing emergency procedures for fire suppression, rapid decompression, hydraulic failure, and engine shutdown. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Manual override, Maya shouted as Hayes and Park fought to maintain control of the aircraft while automated systems tried to implement emergency procedures that would have been catastrophic at their current altitude and speed. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, the cockpit was chaos. Park wrestled with flight controls that were trying to force the aircraft into an emergency descent. Hayes manually overrode fuel systems that were attempting to dump their entire load into the Atlantic. Warning alarms created a cacophony that made communication nearly impossible. But Maya's countermeasures held. The offensive protocols she'd implemented had given her enough access to the attackers' networks to predict and block their most dangerous intrusion attempts. Gradually, the false emergency signals subsided, and normal flight parameters returned. Status report, Maya called out as the immediate crisis passed. Flight controls responding normally, Park reported, all systems showing green. Fuel reserves intact, Hayes added. Whatever you did, it worked. Maya's phone screen showed something even more encouraging. Her offensive cyber operations had not only protected Flight 447, but had also provided enough intelligence about the attackers' methods to help protect the other aircraft that were being targeted. She was connected to Hawthorne again within seconds. Range Legend reporting successful defense of primary target, she said, using the formal language of crisis coordination. I have actionable intelligence on the attack network and am prepared to implement broader countermeasures. Understood, Hawthorne replied. We're tracking defensive success on multiple targets based on your protocols. The immediate threat appears to be neutralized. But Maya was looking at data that suggested the crisis was far from over. The attackers she'd been fighting weren't just criminals or terrorists. They were part of a sophisticated operation with resources and capabilities that rivaled those of major governments. This was a test, she told Hawthorne. They weren't trying to bring down Flight 447. They were testing our response capabilities and gathering intelligence on our countermeasures. The implications hit everyone on the call simultaneously. If this had been a test, then the real attack was still coming. And now the attackers had detailed information about how federal crisis response teams operated when faced with systematic cyber warfare against commercial aviation. How long do we have? Hawthorne asked. Maya looked at the data streaming across her phone screen, analyzing attack patterns and resource deployment in the way that had once made her legendary among crisis coordinators. Based on their operational tempo and the sophistication of their preparation, I'd estimate we have perhaps 72 hours before they launch the real assault. Recommendations? Maya felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again, heavier than ever. She could go back to her apartment in Chicago, feed her fish, and pretend that someone else could handle what was coming. Or she could accept that Range Legend was who she really was, who she'd always been, and prepare to coordinate a defense against an attack that could reshape the entire modern world. I need to be reinstated to full operational status, she said quietly. and I need access to every resource we have for cyber warfare defense. If they want to test our capabilities, I'm going to show them what happens when they threaten innocent people." As Flight 447 continued its flight toward London, now under stable control with all systems functioning normally, Maya began the mental transition back to being someone whose existence was classified and whose responsibilities were measured in the lives of millions of people she would never meet. She thought briefly about Darwin, Curie, and Tesla swimming peacefully in their aquarium, unaware that their owner was about to disappear into a world where crisis coordination was a full-time occupation that left room for little else. But she also thought about the 346 passengers behind her, people who had boarded a flight expecting nothing more dramatic than airplane food and cramped seating, and who deserved to arrive safely at their destinations without ever knowing how close they'd come to becoming casualties in a war they didn't know was being fought. Maya Chen, marine biology researcher, was going back into storage. Range Legend was returning to active duty. The remainder of Flight 447's journey to London passed in what appeared to the passengers as blessed normalcy, but which Maya knew was actually a carefully orchestrated illusion of safety. While travelers dozed, read books, and complained about the airline food, she remained in the cockpit coordinating a response to what intelligence analysis was revealing to be the most sophisticated threat to global transportation infrastructure in modern history. Through her phone's encrypted connection, Maya maintained constant communication with crisis response teams across 3 continents. The attack on Flight 447 had been successful in ways that went far beyond the immediate threat to the aircraft. It had provided the attackers with detailed intelligence on federal response capabilities and revealed vulnerabilities in aviation security that most experts hadn't known existed. "We're tracking at least 47 additional aircraft that were probed during the Flight 447 incident," reported Dr. Sarah Kim, the head of the Department of Transportation's Cybersecurity Division, during a secure conference call as the plane approached British airspace. "The attackers used your defensive measures as a learning opportunity to map our entire crisis response network." Maya absorbed this information while monitoring Flight 447's approach to Heathrow Airport. The landing would be routine from the passenger's perspective, but from an operational security standpoint, it represented the successful completion of the first phase of what was clearly going to be a much larger conflict. "What's our assessment of their ultimate objectives?" Maya asked, though she was already forming her own conclusions based on the technical sophistication and international coordination she'd observed. "Best guess is that they're preparing to demonstrate the ability to ground commercial aviation worldwide," Kim replied. "If they can prove that aircraft systems can be compromised systematically and without warning, public confidence in air travel will collapse even without additional attacks." Captain Hayes had been listening to parts of the conversation while managing the aircraft's descent, and Maya could see him processing the implications of what he was hearing. He was a good pilot with 15 years of experience, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the realization that his aircraft had been used as a testing ground for weapons he'd never imagined. "What happens to us when we land?" Hayes asked, as the lights of London became visible through the cockpit windows. "Standard procedure would be comprehensive debriefing, followed by temporary grounding of all crew members pending security review," Maya replied. "But given the scope of what we're dealing with, I suspect you'll be back in the air sooner than normal. We're going to need experienced pilots who understand what these attacks look like from the cockpit." First Officer Park had been quietly managing landing preparations while listening to the crisis coordination discussions. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked Maya. "You look like you've been carrying this kind of weight for a long time." The question caught Maya off guard, partly because it was exactly the kind of personal observation that people rarely made during crisis operations, and partly because it was true. She did look like someone who'd been carrying impossible responsibilities for years, because that's exactly what she was. "I'll be fine," Maya said, which was both true and not true in ways that were too complicated to explain to someone she'd known for only a few hours. As Flight 447 touched down at Heathrow, Maya felt the familiar mixture of relief and anticipation that came with successfully completing one crisis operation while knowing that larger challenges lay ahead. The passengers would disembark and continue with their lives, most of them never knowing how close they'd come to becoming casualties in a war they couldn't see. But for Maya, landing at Heathrow meant the beginning of a new phase of crisis coordination that would likely consume her life for months or years to come. The attackers who had targeted Flight 447 weren't going to stop with a single demonstration. They were building towards something larger, and stopping them was going to require the kind of comprehensive response that had once made Range Legend legendary among crisis management professionals. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Maya began shutting down the secure communication system she'd been using during the flight, but her phone buzzed with one final message from Hawthorne. Transport arranged for immediate return to Washington. Full operational reinstatement effective immediately. Welcome back, Range Legend. Maya looked out the cockpit window at the normal bustle of a major international airport. Ground crews, baggage trucks, passengers boarding other flights that would carry them safely to destinations around the world. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine staying in London, finding a small apartment near the Thames, maybe getting a job at the Natural History Museum, working with marine specimens in peaceful obscurity. But the fantasy lasted only a moment. Whatever was coming next would threaten not just individual flights or airlines, but the entire interconnected system of modern transportation that millions of people depended on every day. Someone had to stand between that system and the people who wanted to destroy it. Maya Chen had spent 3 years learning to be nobody special. Now it was time for Range Legend to save the world again. The secure facility beneath Reagan National Airport looked exactly the same as it had 3 years ago when Maya had walked away from crisis coordination work. Sterile hallways lined with blast-resistant windows, the constant hum of air filtration systems, and the peculiar atmosphere of a place where the most important conversations happened in rooms that officially didn't exist. But returning to the Emergency Coordination Center, as Range Legend felt different than it had when she'd been a full-time crisis coordinator. The 3 years she'd spent building a normal life had given her perspective on what she'd lost during her original 7 years of service and what she was about to lose again. Director Elizabeth Hawthorne met Maya at the security checkpoint, looking older and more worn than she had during their last conversation. The past 3 years had clearly been challenging for someone responsible for coordinating responses to crises that the public never learned about. "You look good," Hawthorne said, as they walked through corridors lined with classified operational briefings and real-time threat assessments. 3 years of normal life seems to have agreed with you." "It did," Maya replied honestly. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to wake up in the morning without immediately checking threat assessment reports." They entered the main coordination center, where dozens of specialists were working at stations displaying everything from satellite imagery to cyber intrusion analysis. The organized chaos was immediately familiar to Maya, but she also noticed how much the technology had advanced during her absence. "Briefing room 3, Hawthorne said, guiding Maya toward a smaller conference area where the most sensitive discussions took place. "The team leads are waiting." The people gathered around the briefing table represented the best crisis management specialists in the federal government, DRIVE. Sarah Kim from Transportation Security, Colonel Michael Rodriguez from Cyber Command, FBI Deputy Director Jennifer Walsh, and Dr. Amanda Foster from the Department of Homeland Security's Threat Analysis Division. Maya had worked with all of them during various phases of the Meridian crisis, and she could see in their faces the same mixture of relief and concern that always accompanied her return to operational status. "Range Legend," Colonel Rodriguez said as Maya took her seat. "Glad to have you back, even under these circumstances." "Let's start with what we know," Maya said, settling into the familiar rhythm of crisis coordination. "The attack on Flight 447 was sophisticated, internationally coordinated, and specifically designed to test our response capabilities. What have we learned about the attackers?" Dr. Kim activated a large display screen that showed a complex network diagram of the cyber intrusion attempts they detected. "We're calling them the Phoenix Network," she said. "Based on technical analysis of their attack vectors, they appear to be a consortium of state and non-state actors with capabilities that rival our own." The network diagram showed attack origination points in at least 7 different countries, with coordination nodes that suggested a level of international cooperation that would have been difficult for government agencies to achieve, let alone criminal organizations. "Resources?" Maya asked. "Unlimited, as far as we can determine," Deputy Director Walsh replied. "They've invested years in developing these capabilities, and they have detailed intelligence on aviation systems from multiple manufacturers." Maya studied the technical data while processing the operational implications. The attackers weren't just criminals or terrorists. They were part of a sophisticated network with the resources and patience to plan operations that could reshape entire industries. Objectives? She asked. Dr. Foster pulled up another display showing global aviation traffic patterns. Best assessment is that they want to demonstrate the ability to ground commercial aviation worldwide. If they can prove that aircraft systems can be compromised systematically, public confidence in air travel will collapse even without additional attacks. Maya felt the familiar chill that came with understanding the true scope of a crisis. This wasn't just about preventing airplane crashes, it was about protecting the fundamental infrastructure that connected the modern world. Timeline, she asked. Based on the operational tempo we observed during the Flight 447 incident, we estimate they'll launch the main operation within 72 hours, Colonel Rodriguez said. But that's just our best guess. Maya looked around the briefing table at faces she recognized from previous crises, intelligent, dedicated people who had spent their careers protecting systems and infrastructure that most civilians never thought about. She could see in their expressions the same question they'd all been avoiding. Was Range Legend still capable of coordinating a response to something this complex after 3 years away from crisis management work? "What do you need from me?" Maya asked. Hawthorne activated a secure terminal and began displaying operational protocols that Maya hadn't seen since the final phases of the Meridian crisis. "We need you to coordinate a comprehensive defense of global aviation systems," she said. "Not just U.S. carriers, but international coordination with allies who may not realize the scope of what they're facing." The technical requirements were staggering. Maya would need to coordinate with aviation authorities in dozens of countries, implement cybersecurity protocols across thousands of aircraft, and manage crisis response teams that would be working around the clock to prevent attacks they couldn't fully predict. "Operational authority?" Maya asked. "Full discretion," Hawthorne replied. "Same protocols as Meridian crisis. You have authority to coordinate with any agency, access any resource, and implement any countermeasure you deem necessary." Maya felt the weight of that authority settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. During the Meridian crisis, she'd coordinated responses that had involved everything from redirecting military assets to temporarily shutting down critical infrastructure systems. The scope of what she was being asked to do now was even larger. "Team composition?" she asked. Dr. Kim handed her a tablet displaying personnel files for specialists who had been assembled from agencies across the government. Core team of 12, with additional resources available as needed. Most of them worked with you during Meridian. Maya recognized the names and faces, people she'd trusted with impossible responsibilities during 18 months of coordinated crisis response. Seeing them again brought back memories of the intensity and isolation that had ultimately driven her to quit. "One more thing," Deputy Director Walsh said, activating another secure display. "We've been analyzing the attackers' technical capabilities, and we think they may have inside knowledge of our crisis response protocols." The implication hit Maya immediately. Someone with access to classified information about federal emergency procedures had been feeding intelligence to the Phoenix network. The attackers hadn't just been testing aviation security. They'd been testing the specific countermeasures that Range Legend and her teams were likely to implement. "How deep?" Maya asked. "Unknown," Walsh replied. "But they seem to anticipate several of the defensive measures you implemented during the Flight 447 incident." Maya absorbed this information while looking around the briefing table at colleagues she'd trusted with her life during previous crises. The idea that someone in the crisis coordination community might be working with the attackers added a layer of complexity that would make every decision more difficult. "I'll need complete operational independence," Maya said finally. "If there's a security breach in our coordination network, I need to be able to work outside normal channels." Hawthorne nodded. "Already arranged. You'll have access to quantum encrypted communication protocols that are compartmentalized from standard crisis coordination networks." As the briefing continued, Maya felt the familiar transformation taking place. The way her mind automatically shifted into the hyper-aware state that allowed her to process multiple crisis variables simultaneously. She was becoming Range Legend again, accepting responsibility for protecting systems that millions of people depended on without ever knowing how vulnerable they really were. But this time, the transformation felt different. The 3 years she'd spent building a normal life had shown her what she was giving up when she accepted these responsibilities. She knew exactly what it cost to be someone whose existence was classified, and whose personal relationships were secondary to crisis prevention work. Maya thought briefly about her apartment in Chicago, where Darwin, Curie, and Tesla were probably swimming their peaceful circuits, unaware that their owner was about to disappear into a world where marine biology research was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then she put those thoughts aside and began planning a defense against an attack that could reshape the modern world. "I'll need secure workspace, dedicated communication systems, and authorization to coordinate with international partners," Maya said. "And I'll need all of this operational within 6 hours." "Already being prepared," Hawthorne replied. "Welcome back, Range Legend." The secure workspace that had been prepared for Maya was both familiar and alien. The same type of high-tech crisis coordination center she'd worked in for 7 years, but equipped with technology that had advanced significantly during her 3 years away from government service. Multiple displays showed real-time feeds from aviation systems around the world, while quantum-encrypted communication terminals allowed instantaneous coordination with crisis response teams on every continent. But what struck Maya most powerfully was how quickly she fell back into the rhythms of crisis management work. Within an hour of arriving at the workspace, she was coordinating with 12 different agencies simultaneously, implementing defensive protocols for aviation systems across 3 continents, and analyzing attack patterns that were evolving in real time. It was exactly the kind of work that had once consumed her entire identity and ultimately driven her to a nervous breakdown. But now, with 3 years of perspective on what normal life looked like, Maya found herself approaching crisis coordination with a different mindset. She was still completely focused on preventing catastrophe, but she was also acutely aware of what she was sacrificing to do this work. "Range Legend, we're seeing probing attacks on aircraft systems over Eastern Europe," reported Dr. Marcus Webb, her deputy coordinator for international operations. "Pattern matches what we observed before the Flight 447 incident." Maya looked at the real-time data streaming across her displays and immediately saw what Webb was referring to. The Phoenix network was conducting systematic reconnaissance of aviation systems, gathering intelligence for what was clearly going to be a coordinated assault. "Implementation timeline?" she asked. "Based on their operational tempo, we're looking at perhaps 18 hours before they're ready to launch coordinated attacks," Webb replied. Maya felt the familiar pressure that came with time-critical crisis coordination. 18 hours to implement defensive measures for aviation systems that had been designed without consideration for the kind of sophisticated cyber warfare the Phoenix network was capable of deploying. "International coordination status?" she asked. Dr. Sarah Chen, her liaison with foreign aviation authorities, activated a global map showing the status of defensive implementations. "Mixed results," she said. "European Union is fully cooperative and implementing our recommended protocols. Asia-Pacific region is more complicated. Some countries are skeptical about the threat assessment." Maya studied the map and saw immediately what the problem was. Countries that hadn't experienced direct attacks were reluctant to implement emergency protocols that would disrupt normal aviation operations. It was the same pattern she'd seen during the Meridian crisis, the tendency for governments to underestimate threats they hadn't experienced directly. "Demonstration attacks," Maya said, understanding the Phoenix network's strategy. "They're going to hit targets in regions that haven't implemented our defensive protocols, using the casualties to force compliance with their demands." The implication sent a chill through the coordination center. If Maya was right, the Phoenix network was prepared to kill innocent people specifically to demonstrate their capabilities and force changes in global aviation policy. "Recommended response?" Webb asked. Maya looked at the global aviation traffic map and began calculating the implications of different defensive strategies. She could recommend grounding all commercial aviation worldwide, which would prevent attacks but would also cause economic chaos and prove that the Phoenix network had achieved their primary objective. Or she could focus defensive resources on the most likely targets, accepting the risk that attacks might succeed in regions she couldn't adequately protect. It was exactly the kind of impossible decision that had once defined her career as Range Legend, choosing between different types of catastrophe based on calculations that involved the lives of people she would never meet. Selective grounding, Maya decided. Priority protection for high-value targets and demonstration attacks on less protected regions. We let them prove their capabilities on a limited scale while preventing larger-scale casualties. It was a cold calculation that accepted some deaths in order to prevent many more, but it was the kind of decision that crisis coordinators were trained to make when all available options carried unacceptable costs. As Maya's team began implementing selective grounding procedures for aviation systems around the world, her secure communication terminal buzzed with an incoming message from an unknown source. Quote, "Range legend. We know who you are. We know what you've done. Stand down or face consequences beyond your imagination." Maya showed the message to her team leads, watching their faces as they realized the Phoenix network was not only monitoring their response efforts, but was specifically targeting her personally. "Security assessment?" she asked Dr. Foster, who had been analyzing the message's technical characteristics. "The message was routed through the same networks they used for the Flight 447 threats," Foster replied. "But the language and timing suggest they have detailed intelligence on your personal background and operational history." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's air conditioning. The Phoenix network wasn't just attacking aviation systems. They were making it personal, targeting her specifically because of her role in coordinating the response. "Recommendations?" Webb asked. Maya looked around the coordination center at people who had once again entrusted their careers and potentially their lives to her decision-making abilities. She thought about her apartment in Chicago, where she'd spent 3 years learning to be someone whose personal safety wasn't constantly at risk because of her professional responsibilities. Then she thought about the thousands of aircraft currently in flight around the world, carrying millions of passengers who trusted that the systems designed to protect them would continue working as advertised. "We continue operations," Maya said. "If they want to make this personal, they'll discover that Range Legend doesn't respond well to threats." But even as she spoke, Maya was calculating the personal costs of that decision. The Phoenix network clearly had resources and capabilities that rivaled those of major governments. If they were targeting her personally, it meant her carefully constructed normal life in Chicago was probably over, regardless of how this crisis resolved. Maya Chen, marine biology researcher, had been a temporary identity. Range Legend was who she really was and who she was probably going to be for the rest of her life. The next 12 hours unfolded with the relentless intensity that Maya remembered from the worst phases of the Meridian crisis. As the Phoenix network's attacks escalated from reconnaissance to active assault, her coordination center became the nerve center for a global defense effort that involved everything from military cyber warfare units to international aviation authorities who were learning about sophisticated cyber threats for the first time. At 0347 GMT, the Phoenix network launched their demonstration attacks. Maya watched the real-time feeds from around the world as coordinated cyber intrusions simultaneously targeted commercial aircraft over the North Pacific, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. The attacks were precisely timed to occur during peak international flight hours, maximizing both the potential for casualties and the global media impact. Flight KA 2847, Seoul to Los Angeles, reporting complete navigation failure, announced Dr. Chen from her International Coordination Station. Aircraft is maintaining flight on manual navigation but is requesting immediate emergency landing clearance. Lufthansa 1156, Frankfurt to Dubai, experiencing cascading system failures similar to Flight 447, reported Webb from his position managing European operations. Pilots are requesting assistance with countermeasures. Emirates 447, Dubai to London, complete communications blackout, added Dr. Foster. Last contact indicated multiple system compromises in progress. Maya felt the familiar surge of hyper-awareness that came with managing multiple simultaneous crises. Her mind automatically shifted into the state that allowed her to track dozens of variables at once while maintaining focus on the overall strategic situation. "Implementation of countermeasures," she ordered, her voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone that her teams had learned to recognize as Range Legend in full operational mode. Priority to aircraft with highest passenger loads and longest distance from emergency landing options. As her teams began implementing the defensive protocols she'd developed based on the Flight 447 experience, Maya monitored the Phoenix network's response patterns. The attackers were adapting their tactics in real time, probing for weaknesses in her countermeasures, and escalating their attacks whenever they encountered effective resistance. It was exactly the kind of dynamic cyber warfare engagement that had made the Meridian crisis so exhausting, fighting opponents who were intelligent, well-resourced, and capable of learning from every defensive measure her teams implemented. Range Legend, we're seeing coordinated probing attacks on secondary targets, reported Colonel Rodriguez from his cyber warfare coordination station. They're testing our response capacity while managing the primary assaults. Maya looked at the global threat display and immediately understood what was happening. The Phoenix network wasn't just attacking individual aircraft. They were systematically mapping the entire crisis response infrastructure to identify vulnerabilities they could exploit in future operations. Counter-reconnaissance protocols, Maya ordered. If they want to test our capabilities, let's show them what happens when Range Legend stops playing defense. The authorization codes she entered into her secure terminal would have been recognizable to only a handful of people in the federal government, protocols that had been developed during the most classified phases of the Meridian crisis for situations where conventional crisis response methods were insufficient. Within minutes, Maya's teams were implementing offensive cyber warfare tactics that turned the Phoenix network's reconnaissance efforts against them. Instead of simply defending against intrusions, they were tracing attack vectors back to their sources and implementing countermeasures that actively disrupted the attackers' command and control networks. Seoul to Los Angeles flight reporting successful implementation of countermeasures, Dr. Chen announced. Navigation systems restored, flight proceeding normally. Frankfurt to Dubai showing similar success, Webb added. Lufthansa 1156 has regained full system control. But Maya's attention was focused on the Emirates flight over the Eastern Mediterranean, which had gone completely silent 20 minutes earlier. The aircraft was still visible on radar, maintaining course and altitude, but attempts to establish communication had been unsuccessful. Assessment on Emirates 447? Maya asked Dr. Foster. Unknown, Foster replied. Aircraft appears to be flying normally, but we have no communication and no telemetry from onboard systems. It's possible they've been completely compromised, or they might have implemented complete system shutdown as a defensive measure. Maya stared at the radar track showing Emirates 447's position and felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with making decisions about other people's lives based on incomplete information. The aircraft could be flying normally under pilot control, or it could be under complete remote control by the Phoenix network, being used as a test case for more sophisticated attacks. Military assets? She asked Colonel Rodriguez. RAF interceptors are in position to provide visual confirmation, Rodriguez replied. But if the aircraft is under hostile control, intercept options are limited. Maya looked at the global situation display and saw the broader pattern that was emerging. The Phoenix network had successfully demonstrated their ability to compromise commercial aircraft systems. But her countermeasures had prevented the kind of large-scale casualties that would have triggered immediate grounding of global aviation. It was exactly the kind of limited success that made crisis resolution more complicated rather than simpler. The attackers had proven their capabilities without completely achieving their objectives, which meant they would likely escalate to more aggressive tactics. Status report on the security breach investigation. Maya asked Deputy Director Walsh, who had been coordinating efforts to identify potential inside sources of information. We've identified several individuals with access to classified crisis response protocols who have had suspicious contact with foreign intelligence services, Walsh replied. But we haven't confirmed direct cooperation with the Phoenix network. Maya felt a chill as she realized that the security breach might go deeper than anyone had suspected. If people within the crisis coordination community were actively working with the Phoenix network, then every defensive measure she implemented might be compromised before it could be effective. Compartmentalization protocols, Maya ordered. All subsequent operations will use quantum encrypted channels that are isolated from standard crisis coordination networks. As Maya's teams began implementing the new security protocols, her secure terminal displayed an incoming message that made her blood run cold. Maya Chen, 2847 North Lincoln Avenue, Apartment 4B. Your fish are beautiful. It would be unfortunate if something happened to them while you're playing hero. The message included a photograph of her apartment's interior, specifically her aquarium with Darwin, Curie, and Tesla swimming peacefully, unaware that their existence was being used as leverage in a global crisis. Maya stared at the image for a long moment, feeling the familiar rage that came with personal threats during crisis operations. The Phoenix network hadn't just targeted her professionally, they had invaded the one space she'd managed to keep separate from her work as Range Legend. "They've been in my apartment," Maya said quietly, showing the message to her team leads. Dr. Foster examined the technical metadata of the photograph. "Image was taken within the last 6 hours," she reported. "They have active surveillance on your personal residence." Maya felt something shift inside her, the same cold fury that had made her legendary during the worst phases of the Meridian Crisis. The Phoenix Network had made a critical mistake when they'd decided to make this personal. They'd assumed that threatening her civilian identity would make her more cautious, more willing to compromise. They had no idea what Range Legend was capable of when she stopped holding back. "New operational protocols," Maya announced, her voice taking on an edge that her colleagues had learned to recognize as dangerous. "We're done playing defense. Colonel Rodriguez, I need access to our most aggressive cyber warfare capabilities. Dr. Kim, coordinate with international partners for simultaneous offensive operations. Walsh, implement emergency security protocols for all personnel." "Maya," Hawthorne said carefully, "are you sure about this approach? Escalation could—" "They threatened my fish," Maya interrupted, her voice deadly calm. "They broke into my apartment and photographed the one place I thought I could keep separate from this work. They want to see what Range Legend is really capable of? I'm going to show them." The transformation was complete now. Maya Chen, the woman who fed her fish every morning and looked forward to pottery class, was gone entirely. In her place stood Range Legend at full operational capacity. Someone who had once coordinated responses to threats that could have reshaped civilization, and who was about to demonstrate why certain crises required someone willing to fight wars that officially didn't exist. "Implementation of Phoenix Protocol," Maya said, entering authorization codes that would have been recognizable to only 3 people in the federal government. Phoenix Protocol was the most classified crisis response framework in existence, a set of offensive cyber warfare and crisis coordination procedures that had been developed during the final phases of the Meridian Crisis for situations where conventional response methods were insufficient and the threat level justified extraordinary measures. Within minutes, Maya's operation had expanded beyond traditional crisis coordination into active cyber warfare against the Phoenix Network's entire infrastructure. Instead of simply defending aviation systems, she was systematically dismantling the attackers' command and control networks, tracing their financing sources, and implementing countermeasures that would cripple their ability to coordinate future operations. "Range Legend, we're getting real-time intelligence on Phoenix Network operations," Colonel Rodriguez reported. "Your offensive protocols are generating massive amounts of actionable data." Maya's displays showed the Phoenix Network's true scope for the first time, a distributed organization with cells in 14 countries, financing that traced back to several hostile governments, and technical capabilities that had taken years to develop. But the offensive protocols were working, systematically compromising their security and turning their own surveillance networks against them. "Emirates 447 status?" Maya asked while coordinating offensive operations against Phoenix Network command centers. "RAF interceptors report visual confirmation of normal flight operations," Dr. Chen replied. "Pilots appear to be maintaining manual control. We're attempting to re-establish communication using emergency frequencies." Maya felt a moment of relief, but her attention was immediately drawn to new threat indicators appearing on her displays. The Phoenix Network was adapting to her offensive operations by escalating to more aggressive tactics, not just cyber attacks on aircraft, but preparation for physical attacks on aviation infrastructure. "They're targeting airports," Dr. Foster announced, analyzing the intelligence Maya's offensive protocols were generating. "Coordinated assault teams are positioned near major international airports with what appears to be anti-aircraft capabilities." The implications hit Maya immediately. If the Phoenix Network couldn't achieve their objectives through cyber warfare alone, they were prepared to shoot down commercial aircraft during takeoff and landing phases, when they would be most vulnerable and when casualties would be maximized. "Military response authorization?" Colonel Rodriguez asked. Maya looked at the global threat assessment and realized they had reached the point where crisis coordination was transitioning into active warfare. The Phoenix Network wasn't just attacking aviation systems. They were implementing a coordinated assault on international transportation infrastructure that could only be stopped through military intervention. "Coordinate with Pentagon for immediate response to all identified threat locations," Maya ordered, "priority to airports with highest international traffic volume." As Maya's teams began coordinating military responses to physical threats while simultaneously managing cyber warfare operations against the Phoenix network's digital infrastructure, her secure terminal displayed an incoming call from a number she hadn't seen in 3 years. The caller ID simply read Meridian. Maya stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the crisis center's air conditioning. Meridian was the code name for the most classified operation she'd ever coordinated. 18 months of crisis response work that had officially never happened, protecting against threats that the public had never been told about. She answered the call on speakers so her team could hear. "Range Legend," said a voice she'd hoped never to hear again, deep, electronically distorted, and belonging to someone whose identity remained classified even from her. The Phoenix network was never the real threat. They were designed to draw you back into operational status. Maya felt the world shift around her as the implications of what she was hearing became clear. "Elaborate," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the growing horror of understanding. "The Phoenix network is a creation of the same organization you dismantled during the Meridian crisis," the voice continued. "They've spent 3 years developing capabilities specifically designed to force your return to active duty. The aviation attacks were never about grounding air travel. They were about making Range Legend operational again." The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. The sophisticated cyber capabilities that seemed to anticipate her countermeasures, the inside knowledge of crisis response protocols, the personal targeting that had driven her to implement Phoenix Protocol offensive operations. She had been manipulated from the beginning. "Current threat assessment?" Maya asked, though she was beginning to understand that everything she thought she knew about the situation was wrong. "The real operation begins now," the voice replied. "With Range Legend fully operational and committed to Phoenix Protocol authorization levels, they have access to crisis coordination networks that were previously inaccessible. Your offensive operations against the Phoenix network have given them exactly what they needed." Maya looked around the Crisis Coordination Center at her teams, who were staring at her with the growing realization that they had all been expertly manipulated into implementing the very protocols that their unknown enemies had been designed to exploit. "Countermeasures?" she asked, her mind already shifting into the hyper-analytical state that allowed her to think several moves ahead of opponents who had demonstrated they were capable of planning operations that spanned years. "Unknown," the voice admitted. "Range Legend, you're the only person who's ever successfully coordinated a response to this level of sophisticated manipulation. We're trusting you to find a solution that none of us can see." Maya stood in the center of the Crisis Coordination Center, surrounded by the most advanced crisis response technology in the world, coordinating with teams that represented the best crisis management specialists in the federal government, and realized that she was facing an opponent who understood her capabilities better than she understood them herself. The Phoenix network hadn't been attacking aviation systems to ground air travel. They had been attacking aviation systems to force Maya Chen back into operational status as Range Legend. Knowing that her response to personal threats would drive her to implement offensive protocols that would give them access to the most classified crisis coordination networks in existence. Everything that had happened, from the attack on Flight 447 to the threats against her apartment, had been carefully orchestrated to manipulate her into making exactly the decisions she had made. But Maya also realized something that her manipulators might not have anticipated. 3 years of normal life had given her perspective on crisis coordination work that she'd never had before. She understood now what it cost to be Range Legend, and she understood the difference between necessary responses and responses driven by personal anger. "New operational framework," Maya announced to her teams. "We're shutting down Phoenix Protocol and implementing emergency containment procedures for all offensive operations." "Maya," Colonel Rodriguez said carefully, "if we shut down our offensive capabilities while they have access to our networks, they'll have exactly what they wanted from the beginning," Maya finished. "Which means our offensive capabilities were never going to be effective against them anyway. They've been planning for our responses for 3 years." Maya looked at her secure terminal and began implementing protocols that she'd hoped never to use. Emergency procedures for completely isolating crisis coordination networks when they had been compromised beyond recovery. "What are you doing?" Dr. Foster asked. "I'm taking away their access to our systems by taking away our access to our systems," Maya replied. "If they've been manipulating us into giving them what they wanted, then the only way to stop them is to deny them what they've already gained." It was exactly the kind of counterintuitive solution that had made Range Legend legendary during the Meridian crisis. accepting short-term disadvantage in order to prevent long-term catastrophe. As Maya implemented emergency isolation protocols that would shut down the most advanced crisis coordination systems in the world, her teams watched in fascination and horror as their capabilities were systematically reduced to basic communication and coordination tools. "Range Legend," the distorted voice said through her secure terminal, "you're isolating yourself from the very resources you need to coordinate a response." "I'm isolating myself from the resources they've been using to manipulate my responses," Maya corrected. "Which means whatever comes next, we'll be facing it on equal terms instead of playing a game where they've rigged all the rules." Maya looked around the Crisis Coordination Center, which had been transformed from one of the most technologically sophisticated facilities in the world into something that resembled a basic emergency management office from the 1990s. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the confidence that came with knowing she was making decisions based on her own analysis, rather than responding to crises that had been designed to manipulate her responses. "Status report on all aircraft currently in flight," Maya said, returning to the fundamental responsibility that had drawn her back into crisis coordination work. "All targeted aircraft have successfully implemented basic countermeasures," Dr. Chen reported. "Emirates 447 has re-established communication and is proceeding to London normally. No aircraft are currently in immediate danger." Maya felt a moment of relief, but she also understood that the resolution of the aviation crisis was just the beginning. If the Phoenix network had been designed to manipulate her into implementing protocols that gave unknown enemies access to classified crisis coordination systems, then the real threat was still developing. "Threat assessment for secondary operations?" she asked. Dr. Foster was working with severely limited analytical tools, but her experience with crisis assessment was extensive enough to allow educated analysis even without advanced technology. "Unknown actors now have access to detailed intelligence on our crisis response capabilities," she said. "They could use that intelligence to plan attacks on any infrastructure system we're responsible for protecting." Maya understood the implication. By manipulating her into implementing Phoenix Protocol, the unknown enemies behind the Phoenix network had gained intelligence that could be used to compromise everything from power grids to financial systems to transportation networks. She had been outmaneuvered by opponents who understood her psychology and operational patterns better than she understood them herself. But Maya also realized that being outmaneuvered wasn't the same as being defeated. Range Legend had become legendary not because she was impossible to manipulate, but because she was capable of finding solutions even when she had been placed at severe disadvantage. "New mission parameters," Maya announced. "We're going to find out who's behind the Phoenix network, and we're going to stop them before they can use the intelligence they've gained to launch whatever operation they've really been planning." It was exactly the kind of impossible assignment that had once defined her career as Range Legend, protecting systems and people from threats that were more sophisticated than the defensive capabilities available to stop them. "How?" Webb asked. Maya looked around the Crisis Coordination Center at people who had once again entrusted their careers and potentially their lives to her decision-making abilities. She thought about her apartment in Chicago, where Darwin, Curie, and Tesla were swimming in their aquarium, unaware that their existence had been used as leverage in a conflict that spanned continents. Then she thought about the thousands of aircraft that were currently flying safely around the world because her teams had successfully prevented the Phoenix network from achieving their stated objectives, even if those objectives had been misdirection from the beginning. "The same way we always do," Maya said. "We start with what we know, we build from there, and we don't stop until everyone gets home safely." As Maya began coordinating the next phase of what was clearly going to be an extended operation, she felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and determination that came with accepting impossible responsibilities in order to protect people who would never know how close they had come to catastrophe. Range Legend was back, whether she wanted to be or not, but this time she was going to find a way to win that didn't require sacrificing everything else that made life worth living. 6 months later, Maya stood in her apartment in Chicago, watching Darwin, Curie, and Tesla swim their peaceful circuits in the aquarium that had been rebuilt after the Phoenix network investigation. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had before her return to crisis coordination work, but Maya knew she would never again be the woman who had fed her fish every morning while pretending that someone else could handle the crises. The Phoenix network had been dismantled, their unknown sponsors identified and neutralized, and the intelligence they had gained through their manipulation rendered useless through comprehensive security overhauls. But the operation had taken 6 months of the kind of intensive crisis coordination work that consumed everything else in life. Maya had won, but she had also learned something important about herself. She couldn't go back to being nobody special because Range Legend wasn't just a job designation, it was who she was at the deepest level. But she had also learned that being Range Legend didn't require sacrificing everything else that mattered. The woman who coordinated responses to threats that could reshape civilization was also someone who could feed her fish every morning and look forward to pottery class on Tuesday nights. Maya's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message from Hawthorne. New situation developing, international scope, could use Range Legend's expertise. Maya looked at the message for a long moment, then at her fish swimming peacefully in their carefully maintained ecosystem. She thought about the pottery class she was supposed to attend that evening, and the normal life she had worked so hard to build and rebuild. Then she picked up the phone and typed back, Range Legend responding, send briefing materials. Because some responsibilities were tattooed too deep to ever fade completely, and some identities were worth the sacrifices they required. Outside her window, Chicago continued its normal rhythms, unaware that the woman in apartment 4B was preparing to coordinate another response to threats they would never know existed. And that was exactly how it should be. Range Legend was back where she belonged, standing between chaos and catastrophe, making sure that ordinary people could continue living ordinary lives in a world that was far more dangerous than they realized. Maya fed her fish, grabbed her secure communications gear, and prepared to save the world again. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.